We're starting on Pei Dalet Amud Aleph, actually the last two words in Pei Gimel Amud Rava. So yesterday we learned about a svina, a ship. A svina, we said, is tahar. It's not mekabel tumah, and we said two reasons. One reason is because it's a belev yam. It's hukash to a yam, just like a yam does not mekabel tumah, so too the svina is not mekabel tumah. And the second reason is because it's hukash l'sak, to a sack, and a sack is metali mali rekum. You have to be able to carry it full and empty. But a sfina is so large you cannot move it it's a male. You cannot be metaltal. Therefore, it's tar. So Amar Rava u'lechananya. According to Chananya, that says tiltel aidei shvarim shmei tiltel. If you could move something, you could carry something with oxen, is shmei tiltel. So therefore, a sfina is metaltel male, even though it's large, but you could be metaltel aidei shvarim. So therefore, it's tamei, according to Chananya. How do you know that tilta aidei shvarim is shmei tiltel? That now we learned on Mishnah. Shalosh hagolos hey. There are three types of wagons. So asuya kit titra. If it's very short, Rashi says, umukfish misholet stadim. It's open. It's enclosed from three sides. It's open on one side. So that wagon is tameya medris. Is tameya medris. Rashi says, because sheli yeshiva miyuchedesi. It's set aside, it's designated for yeshiva to sit, so therefore there's tumas medris. If the wagon is kemita, that it's very long, right, and it's there to transport things, then tamei mace. It's tamei tumas mace, not medris. And Rashi says that since it's not miyuchedes for yeshiva, it's there to transport pergamatia, merchandise. So therefore Rashi says, in other words, you can't sit on it, we need it for transport. So therefore there's no tumas medris, there's a tumas mace. The shalavarim, if the wagon is there to transport these large rocks, so therefore it's not covered at the bottom, there's holes. So then it's not even a keli, because the holes won't let you do anything with it. It's only for large rocks. If the holes are small, that a rimon, a pomegranate, will not fall through those holes of the bottom of the wagon, then tameya tamei mace. Now if you look at Rashi, Rashi says, V'amar Rabbi Yechanan, Alma afagav the shel eitz iskash l'sak the beina metaltel mali v'rekon v'zu einu metaltelis elai de shvarim kamar tameya tamas mace. So you see that if it's tilta de shvarim, it is tummy mace. So that is the raya according to Chananya. So here too, the boat, if it's moved with the ship, with the shvarim, with oxen, then it'll be tummy. The Mishnah continues and says, we were talking about wagons, three types of wagons. Now, shalosh tevas hein. There are three types of boxes. A box that teva shepischa mitzida, that's open from the side, so therefore you could lay on it. Then tameya medris, that right. If it's milmala, if the opening is a box like our boxes, not from the side, but it's open from the top, then tameya tamei mace. So it's not meant to sit on it, to lay it out. It's meant to use it as a keli. So it's tamei mace. And then the Mishnah ends up and says, if the box is so large that it's ba mimida, then tahir bekulam. If you look at Rashi in the wide lines, about 10, 12 lines down in the wide lines, a ba mimida, it's teva gedola. It's a large box. She'enim metaltelis. You cannot move it. In other words, it's enclosed, it just has a window to use it. So tahir mekulan lemedris lechazi hayo v'chaloina melmala einim mishamem eshkiva melachtai. Since it's closed, so you cannot sit on it. Ulishar tumas lechazia. Why? It's not even a keli. The einim metaltelis meleya. It's a very large box. But the main thing is, we brought a proof from here that according to Chananya, if you hold tilta idei shvarim shmei tilto, this svina will be tamei. So we'll continue on Pei Dalet Amud Aleph, about 7 lines down. Tana Rabbanon. Medres kli cheres tar. A kli cheres is an earthenware, a keli. So if a zav sits on it, that's medras, then it will be tar. Rashi says, Shem Yoseph olav hazav v'lo noga ba'avira. Now, kli cheres gets its tumah only from the inside, not migaboy, not from the outside. So if a zav sits on it, but v'lo naga b'avira, he did not touch anything in the inside of the klicheres, tar. Ve'ena b'tamim mishum medris, and we'll see that l'kami yalv le'mikra. So back to the Gemara. So medris klicheres tar. Rabbi Yossi Omer makes a statement, af hasfina, even the sfina. So for the Gemara, my kamar. Rashi says, ma inyan sfina etzel medris. Sfina tahira af mitumas maga. Not only medris, of sitting on it, even if you touch a sfina, if somebody's tummy and touches a sfina, it's completely tar. Ula medris lechazia, so what does it mean, af hasfina? So my kamar, so Amr Abzvit, so Rav Zvit answers and says, hachi kamar. We start the Bryce like this. Medres, klicheres is tar, right? If a zav sits on the klicheres, it's tar. But umagai, if the zav touches the inside of the klicheres, then it becomes tame. The sfina shel cheres, in other words, in a boat that's made out of cheres, so it's not dum yirasak, it doesn't have to be dum yirasak, then it will be tameya kechananya, because it's not hukas the sak in the Torah, and therefore, even though it's not metaltal mole, still it is tameh. Then Rabbi Yossi comes along and says, af asvina tahira kitani didan. In other words, Rabbi Yossi comes along and says, no, a svina is hukash, is compared to the leiv yam, and just like a yam is not tameh, so too a svina is not tameh. So now the Gemara has a problem. According to the way Rav Zvit is explaining this brisa, Maska Rav Papa, my af. When Rabbi Yossi says af asvina tahora, the word af does not make sense. Rashi explains, my af sfina al karcha tahira mimaga kamar. When Rabbi Yossi is saying that the sfina is tar, it means even from tumas maga. So therefore, the word my af, holei tir tanakama kli mimaga. In other words, the Tanakama did not mitar the kli from the maga, the name afsu kiyotzebo. So therefore, the language of the brisa afsu does not make sense, because even the Tanakama says that it's still tar, it's tummy for maga. So Elam Rapapa, you have to explain the brisa a little differently. Hachi kamar, medris klicheres tar. If a zav sits in a klicheres, it's tar, because the tumah only comes from the inside of the klicheres, right? But umaga, but if the zav touches the inside of the klicheres, then it becomes tameh. The shell eitz, if the keli is not made out of cheres, it's made out of eitz, so it's hukash sak, bei medrasa, bei magai, tameh. So there's tumas medris and tumas maga. The sfinas hayardain, but the sfinas hayardain will be tahar. Why? Because kitana didan. Because you learn it out from leiv yam. So it doesn't make a difference how large the sfina is. In other words, it's tar. And that's why Rabbi Yossi comes along and says, af asfina tameya. No, a sfina is tameh, because kechananya. He learns out that the whole limud, why you are tar, is dum yidasak. If it's not metal, but a kli cheres, right? And a sfina, we say, is, if it's made out of cheres, so we say that it is tar. Okay. Now the Gemara goes back and says, "Umedris kli cheres minol in the tar." The Brisa made a statement that if a zav sits on a kli cheres, in other words, an earthenware keli, it's tar. There's no tumas medris. Why is that? Where do you know that from? And the zav, like we explained, did not touch the inside of the kli cheres. He only sat on top of it. So where do you know that from? So the Amachizkia, the Amakra says in Pasuk, the ish asheyiga mimishkavo, a person that touches his mishkavo. Makis mishkavo, the zav's mishkavo, his bed low. Mahu, the islay tar of a mikvah, just like the zav could, even though he's tamei now, but he could become tar going into a mikvah. Av mishkavo, the tumas medris, that he makes something tamei through sitting on it. Nami islay tar mikvah. It has to be, whatever he's making tameh has to be able to get tar in the mikvah. And we know a kli cheres does not have tar in the mikvah. Rashi says, the ksiv, the second line from the bottom, the ksiv yishavar. Ein loy tahara el shvirasai. Kli cheres, if it becomes tameh, it's earthenware, the only way it gets its tara is through breaking it. So since there's no tara in mikvah, that's why there's no tumas medris. And to be Rabbi Shmuel Tana, he comes along and says, how do you know that there's no tumah medris by a kli cheres, because it says ki mishkav nididasoi yelo. Mak is mishkava lo. To a zava. In other words, mahi the zava isle tara b'mikvah. Af mishkava, when she is metame, a zava is metame through tumas medris. Nami isle tara b'mikvah. Again, lafuki kli cheres, the less tara b'mikvah, like Rashi said, that it has to be broken. So Masud Rabbi Loi. So now we established that a zav, if he sits on a kli cheres, there's no tumas medris and it's tar.
Why?
What's that?
Why did you establish that? Maybe.
Now the pasuk said that.
No, but maybe it means just like this mita. If he makes it tummy, you can be matar. But this case.
But the bed gets a tara through a mikvah.
Right.
But if a kli cheres gets tummy through that zav by sitting on it, what do you do now? It becomes tummy. There's no tahara. It has to be broken. Now, there's no tar of mikvah. It has to be dum yelo. Just like when he becomes tameh, he goes into the mikvah, becomes tar. So anything that a zav is mitameh, in other words, through medris, has to be the ability to go into the mikvah. And a kli cheres does not have that ability. So, Masud Rabbi Loi, he'll ask a question. It says, a mapitz b'meit b'nayim. You have a mat made out of reeds. So, how do you know that it becomes tameh through a mace, tumas mace? Now Rashi, the bottom here says, the last word, the last line, shu tameh, l'fi shematzinu shepshutikli eitz tahirin. A normal pshutikli eitz that does not have a base kibble, that cannot hold something in it, is tar mitumas magasheretz, right? Minayin shekeli harol mishkav moshe. But this mat, since it's row, in other words, to sit on it, to lay on it, so it will be mekabel tumas maga b'mace, through a mace. How do you know that? So v'dinhu, the Gemara says, I have a kal v'chomer, ma pachin ketanim, and I'm at base now. Ma pachin ketanim, small vessels, shetahorim b'zav, they will be tar through a zav. Rashi says, pachin ketanim shel cheres, it's made out of cheres. Shetahorim b'zav, she'ena mitamem al yado, mishum tuma. In other words, if you have this small kli cheres, the pachim that are made out of cheres, there's no tumah that could come to it. Because why? Rashi says, "L'medris lechazi." There's no tumah medris if a zav sits on it. They're so small that you can't sit on it. The oat shein shel cheres. It's also made out of cheres, and we just had the pasuk to tell you that there's no tumah through a zav. Right? And through touching these pachim ketanim, there's no tumah. The aim etam is el maviron. You have to get inside. In other words, you have to get inside the kli cheres. But these pachim ketanim, you can't get your finger in there. The zav cannot get his finger. In other words, it's so narrow, you can't get anything in. So it says, so back to Gemara now. So ma pachim ketanim shetahorim b'zav. There's no way that tumah comes to these pachim ketanim. Through medras it can't, like we explained, and through mag also, because you can't get inside. Still we say, tamei and b'meis, if they're in a oel, a mace. In other words, if there's a dead body in a room, and you have these pachim ketanim that have a small opening, we say the pachim ketanim that are made out of cheres become tamei because of the mace. And not that it touched the mace, but the aviro, the ear in the room, is all tamei. If you have a mace here, everybody sitting here, even though you don't touch the mace, right, you become automatically tamei. So these pachim ketanim, if they're in the room, the tumah will go right through that little, you don't need a finger to push it in. The air goes right into the pachim ketanim. So there's tumah's mace by these pachim ketanim. So in other words, the pachim ketanim do not get a tumah through a zav, but still tamei and b'meis. So mapitz, this is the brisa, a mapitz, a mat, shetamei b'zav, a mat that a zav could sit on, right? So it becomes tamei through a tumah's medris, ain't it din she tamei b'meis? So for sure, if it's in an oil, that a room where a mace is, the mapit should be tamei, right? So that's the brisa. That's when the brisa asks, mapitz minayin, where do you know a mat becomes tamei through oil ha-mace? We know it from this kal v'chomer. But for the Gemara now, v'amai, holes le'tara b'mikvah, this mapit does not have a tara in the mikvah. And now we're establishing, even though there's no tar b'mikvah, like a kli cheres, just like we said before, on Amud Aleph, a kli cheres. The reason why there's no tumas medris is because you cannot put it into a mikvah. A mapit also, that's made out of kli eitz, there's no mikvah. Why? Rashi explains. Look at Rashi. Leslie tar b'mikvah in the narrow lines, about 10 lines from the bottom of the narrow lines. The ksiv tefillah b'parshas Shratzim or b'parshas Midyan ksiva. It says there when they came back from the war of Milchemes Midyan. B'hanach kelim the ksiva hasam yalfina lehu tefillah. All the kelim that's written in that parsha of Kli Midyan, that is where tefillah applies. In other words, you could use tefillah to mitar it. Aval pshuti Kli eitz, Rashi says, shlei nichtav sham linyan tuma lo yalfina lehu tefillah. It doesn't say anything about tuma on a pshute Kli eitz, so therefore we don't know anything about a mikvah process of a pshute Kli eitz. So therefore, v'les le tar b'mikvah. A mapet, a mat that's made out of wood, there's no tar b'mikvah. Though like siva b'hu. In other words, it doesn't say there in the parsha. So in other words, a mapet of made out of wood does not have tar b'mikvah because it doesn't say that in the parshas Midyan by the kalim there. So therefore, how does it become tamei? We just established the reason why a kli cheres does not have a tumah zav is because there's no tar b'mikvah. So this mapet kliyet should not have any tumah because there's no tar b'mikvah. So how does the brisa make a kavaklimi to say there should be tumah? So Gemara says, no. Amalei Rechanina. How do you compare a mat made out of wood to a kli cheres that a zav sat on? Shani asam hoyel v'ikka b'minoi. By a kliyet. In other words, if it's not a mapit, whether it's pshute kliyet, but if a keli with a base kibble is made out of eitz, there is tumah and there is tara b'mikvah. So therefore, since wood could go into a mikvah, even though these mapats, this mat cannot go in because it's pshute, it's flat, but still it is considered to be able to get a tumah. But by kli cheres, there is no tumah at all in b'minoi. So Amalei Rachamona Litzla Maidaita. That's the way you explain it. That doesn't make sense. The Torah should save us from a person that says such a sephara. So then the other Amora comes back and says, Adarabba, Rachamona Litzla Maidaita Dedach. The Torah should save us from your svaras. But v'taimamai, what's the difference between the mapets that's made out of wood, that's pshute, we say that it could become tamei, and the kli cheres we establish on Am Aleph that it could not become tamei through a zav? So where it says, the Torah says two psukim. It says, Ksiv, the ish ashiyiga mimishkavo, we're comparing the zav to its mishkavo, to his mishkav, his tumas medres, and then it says, the Ksiv, v'chola mishkav ayishkav olav azav, itamei. Then it says a statement, doesn't say mishkavo, that has to be similar to him. It means anything a zav sits on it becomes tamei. So here we have one pasuk that tells you it has to be exactly similar to a zav. That means just like a zav goes into a mikveh becomes tar, the object that a zav is metame through medris also has to be able to go into the mikveh. And then you have a pasuk that says anything he sits on it becomes tamei. Okay, so how does that work out? So yesh biminoi, if it has in its min, like the mapets, the mat made out of wood, even though it itself does not go into the mikveh, but another kli eitz that has a base kibble could go into the mikveh. So therefore, the mapet afagav lesle tar mikveh will become tamei through the zav. But ein b'minoi, but a kli cheres that has nothing, anything made out of kli cheres, there is no tar b'mikveh. Therefore, makis mishkav aloi. Then we would compare the tumas medrus of a zav to the zav, and the only way a zav could be metame a kli cheres, only if there's tara b'mikvah. And since there's no tara b'mikvah by a kli cheres because it has to be broken, therefore if a zav sits on a kli cheres, we establish in Amud Aleph that it is tar. Rava Amar medrus kli cheres tar mehacha. In other words, I have another pasuk to teach you that if a zav sits on a kli cheres, there's no tumah through tumas medrus. But the pasuk says the chol kali pesuach. If there's an open keli, ashe ain't summit pasul alav, that does not have a seal on it, and it is in a tumah, it's in a room where there's a mace, so that keli will become tamei because of the mace. But it's mashma hoyesh summit pasul alav. If it would have a seal, a cover on this keli, and it's sealed, and it's in a room where there's a mace, then the Torah is telling you that it is tar. It does not get that tumas mace. Now, milay askinon, this keli that is sealed, we're saying it's tar. but maybe it was a keli, the yachadiu lishtanida, that the person set it aside for his wife. That's a nida. And still, if she sits on it, even though it's sealed, it's still the keli, everything inside the keli is tar. Mila askinan, that the yachadiu lishtanida, become rachmana, is tar. So look at Rashi. Mila askinan, mila mashma b'mikra, that fila yichad alaisa keli, li'ishtay nida li'eshav alav kol yameh, Amakra, the Torah says, even though the keli is made for your wife to sit, that she's a zava, the Torah says that matzla masha v'toicha b'olam meis. If it's sealed, everything inside this keli is tar. But if tamei medris, if a keli becomes tamei medris, heichem matzl. How could you save it inside? In other words, once the wife sat on it, everything becomes tamei there. But kol davar tumah eino chaytziv ne'atumah. If the keli becomes tamei because of tumas medris, automatically everything inside, even though it's sealed, should become tamei. Elish mamina, if the Torah says if this keli is sealed, the klicheres that is sealed in a room where there's a mace is tar, must be the ein medris b'klicheres. There's no medris. So even if your wife sat on it as a zava, the keli does not become tamei. So therefore, even though it's in a room where there's a mace, but since it's sealed, it's a tzamid pasel, it is tar. So that's the raya that there's no tumas medris by a klicheres. Okay, Mishnah. Minayin la'aruga shisha al shisha tfachim. Now, if you're planting your garden, so there's an isser of klayim. You cannot mixture different types of things in your garden. So what do? You have to make sure that it's not yonek. It doesn't get any nourishment from the other side, right? So if you have a large enough garden, you could plant one species, like one thing on this side and another thing on this one. So now if you have a garden that's shisha al shisha tfachim, that is 6 by 6, so you know what you could do? The Mishnah says, you could plant different types of seeds. Chamishas aronim, you could plant 5 types of seeds and there's no isser klayim. How is that? So the Mishnah says, Dalit al Dalit Ruchos. If you look at the picture in Rashi, you could plant one type of a seed, 4 different types on the sides. You have to make sure that the corner are left empty, and you're allowed to plant along the side. And then, Ba'achas be'emsa, and then you could plant a different type of seed right in the middle. So here, Rashi explains it, is normally, if you have, let's say, a fence on your garden, you could plant one type of seed on this side, even though they're next to each other. But if you have a fence, there's a hecker that they're not next to each other. So the hecker, that fence makes it a hecker, even though it should be 3 tfachim away from each other. But the fence allows it a gabi klayim, since it's only a derabanan diki isser, you're allowed to build a fence in your garden. You could plant one thing and another thing, even though they're so close to each other. So here too, Rashi explains, since you left the corners empty, that is like a fence, that's a hecker. That's showing me that they're not next to each other. I left it open. So that is allowed. And the middle one is enough of 3 tfachim away from the sides. So therefore the Mishnah says that I could plant in a garden that's 6 by 6, I could plant 5 different types of seeds. Where do you see that from? Shenemar, it says in Pasuk, Kicha aretz totzi. The land will give out semecha, ukegina zerahel, tasmiach, will sprout. So it says zara loy nemar, it says elizarah, its seed, plural. So how do you know that this pasuk means that you could even plow, you could seed 5 types of seeds? So the Gemara explains, my mashma, how do you see that from the pasuk? Rabbi Yehuda, plus kika aret, totzi tzmecha. So totzi is chad, 1 seed. Semecha is haritrei, right? So you have 2. The Torah says you could put in the ground 2. Zirah, then it says zirah, which is another 2, trei. So now you have arba, you have 4 types of seed. Then the Torah says tatzmiach, chad. So you have 5 types of seed. Hachamisha. So you have 5 different types of seeds that you could plow. And the Gemara says the kimle rabbanan, the chamisha b'shita lo yanke. When you put 5 different types of seeds in a area of 6 tfachim, lo yanke me'adadi, they won't get any nourishment, right? And then we'll learn tomorrow minalan. So therefore, from the pasuk we see that they're allowing you to seed 5, and it will be a 6 by 6, and the Torah says you could do it. In other words, like I explained, the only reason why the sides, even though they're not, normally you have to have 3 tvachim away to be able to see different type of things, or else there's a problem of klayim. But since you have a heker, and that heker allows you in the corners where you didn't plant, that allows you to seed 4 on the sides and 1 in the middle. Shkoach.